Let me tell you something that might sting a little. Just because he acts like you don't matter doesn't mean you don't. Just because he's silent doesn't mean he's over it. And just because he looks detached doesn't mean he's not thinking about you more than he'll ever admit. People don't always show what they feel, especially not people who've built their entire emotional survival strategy around avoidance. That emotional shutdown, that sudden coldness, that pretending like you were never there behavior, it's not peace, it's not indifference, it's not healing, it's discomfort in disguise, it's fear wrapped in ego, and most of all, it's someone choosing not to deal with the weight of what they felt, not because you meant nothing, but because you meant more than they were ready for. Avoidant attachment doesn't scream, "I don't care." It whispers, "This is too much." It pulls back the moment things get deep, real, vulnerable. So if you're sitting there wondering, did I imagine the connection? Did I overthink everything? The answer is no. What you saw was real. What you felt was mutual. But not everyone who feels love knows how to hold it. He doesn't ignore you because you didn't matter. He ignores you because silence feels safer than honesty. Because emotional honesty requires self-awareness, vulnerability, and the courage to sit in discomfort. And not everyone has practiced that kind of courage, especially someone avoidant. People like him don't avoid because they don't feel, they avoid because they feel too much. And when those feelings come rushing in, they trigger a flood of discomfort they were never taught to manage. So instead of leaning in, he pulls away. Instead of talking it out, he disappears. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered more than he could control. And here's where it messes with your mind. You replay the last thing you said. You analyze the shift in his tone. You wonder what you missed or what you did wrong. You start to believe maybe you asked for too much, gave too much, felt too much. But what if I told you it wasn't about you at all? What if I told you that the moment things got emotionally close, he began protecting himself the only way he knew how, with silence, withdrawal, avoidance? Because deep emotional closeness for someone who fears vulnerability feels like danger, feels like exposure, feels like stepping too close to a wound they've spent years covering up. And so he builds distance. He acts fine. He goes quiet. But fine doesn't always mean healed, quiet doesn't always mean calm, and distance doesn't always mean done. Sometimes it just means overloaded, unprepared, frozen. Think about it. How many times have you wanted to speak your truth, but stopped yourself because it felt too risky, because it made you feel too exposed? Now imagine someone who never learned that vulnerability can be safe, someone who believes that being emotionally seen is the same as being weak. That's the person who ghosts. That's the person who pulls away and pretends not to feel, not because they don't care, but because they've never learned how to care out loud. And so he stays silent. He convinces you, and maybe even himself, that it meant nothing, that he's moved on, that it was just a moment. But silence, when it's this loud, doesn't come from indifference. It comes from internal chaos, from feelings too big to face, from memories too charged to revisit. And while he may be quiet on the outside, he's likely battling a storm on the inside, one he doesn't want you, or even himself, to see the danger in all of this, in his silence, his distance, his detachment, is what it does to your mind. Because the human brain craves narrative. When someone disappears or goes quiet, when they suddenly treat you like a stranger after treating you like home, your brain doesn't rest. It writes stories, it searches for meaning, and most of the time the only story it has to pull from is your own self-doubt. If he's not reaching out, I must not have mattered. If he can walk away this easily, maybe I was the problem. If I was more chill, more easygoing, more lovable, maybe he'd still be here. That's the trap. That's what emotional avoidance does. Not just to the avoidant person, but to the one who was left behind. It makes you carry the weight of their emotional unavailability, and you start to mistake their fear for your failure. You start shrinking to fit into a version of yourself that would have made them stay. But here's the truth no one tells you. It wasn't that you were too much. It's that what you offered required more emotional maturity than he had access to. Vulnerability terrifies people who don't trust emotions. And when someone's whole coping strategy is to distance themselves from the messiness of human connection, what do you think happens when you hand them something real? They panic, they freeze, they shut down. Avoidant attachment doesn't just say, I can't do this. It says, if I get too close, I'll lose control. I'll be exposed. I'll get hurt. I'll hurt you. So they armor up. They tell themselves they're fine. They tell you it wasn't serious. They act indifferent. But that's just the defense mechanism talking. If he were really indifferent, he wouldn't need to avoid you. If he were truly over it, he wouldn't need to pretend. If you didn't matter, your memory wouldn't still show up in the cracks of his day. Avoidance is effort. It's emotional gymnastics. It's checking your profile at 2 a.m. and then acting like you don't exist. It's hearing your name and tightening his jaw. It's pushing down a wave of emotion he can't name and hoping that if he ignores it long enough, it'll just disappear. But that's not healing. That's hiding. And hiding takes energy. If you were truly irrelevant, there'd be nothing to hide from, no emotion to suppress, no discomfort to navigate. Real indifference is relaxed. It's quiet. It doesn't flinch when you're mentioned. It doesn't over-explain or over-justify. But avoidance is tense, reactive, defensive. It needs a whole performance to keep the mask in place. So if he's acting like he doesn't care, but going out of his way to maintain that illusion, ask yourself, who is he trying to convince? You or himself? This is where it gets cruel, because you're not just dealing with heartbreak, you're dealing with gaslighting, not the malicious kind, but the emotional kind. The kind that makes you doubt your own experience because the other person refuses to acknowledge theirs. And so you're left in the dark trying to find closure in a silence that isn't honest, trying to make peace with a version of events that was never fully real. And all the while, he's not processing anything. He's escaping it, telling himself stories that let him stay disconnected, not because he doesn't feel, but because he doesn't know how to feel through it. So he opts for control, and in that control, he trades resolution for repression, vulnerability for ego, depth for distance. But repression doesn't erase feelings, it buries them, and buried feelings don't die. They wait. So let's go deeper into what's really happening beneath the surface of avoidant attachment, because on the outside, he looks fine. Better than fine even. He's smiling, laughing, dating, socializing. He seems lighter, freer, like he's thriving in your absence. But what you're seeing is the highlight reel, a curated version of reality designed to convince the world and himself that he's unaffected. But avoidance is a performance. And like all performances, it's rehearsed, controlled, carefully edited to hide the mess behind the curtain. The truth is, most avoidantly attached people don't process emotions. They escape them. They don't sit with pain. They distract from it, not because they don't have feelings, but because those feelings feel dangerous, overwhelming, like a loss of control. So they pivot to work, to casual relationships, to drinking, partying, scrolling, talking to new people who don't know the version of themselves they tried to bury. Anything that keeps them busy, anything that keeps them away from stillness, because stillness is where the feelings live. And feelings, especially deep, vulnerable, attachment-based emotions, threaten everything they've spent years trying to suppress. And what happens when you suppress something long enough? It doesn't disappear, it waits, it mutates, it leaks out in other ways, in dreams, in sudden anxiety, in irritability, in that strange hollow feeling that no one else can quite touch. He might not be crying over you, but he's not sleeping well. He might not be talking about you, but you still live rent-free in the places he doesn't share with anyone. Because let's be honest, you weren't a fling. You weren't surface level. You weren't forgettable. You saw him, really saw him. And for someone avoidant, that's terrifying. Because being seen means being vulnerable. And being vulnerable means giving up the armor, the mask, the narrative that says, I'm fine, I don't need anyone. But he did need you, maybe more than he was ready to admit. And that's what scared him. That's what triggered the retreat, because people with avoidant attachment don't know how to exist inside deep emotional connection. Not because they don't want to, but because they've never been taught how to feel safe there. Maybe for him, emotional closeness growing up was conditional. Maybe it was absent. Maybe it came with guilt or shame. So now, even when love shows up in a healthy way, his first instinct is to run, to push it away before it can hurt him, to reject intimacy before intimacy can reject him. That's what happened with you. You didn't scare him because you were too intense. You scared him because you were real, because you got past the armor, because your presence activated a version of him he didn't know how to hold, the soft, vulnerable, authentic version. And the closer he got to you, the harder it became to pretend. So he did what he's always done when closeness gets too close. He distanced. Not because he stopped caring, but because caring felt like surrender, like a loss of control, like a threat to the fragile emotional balance he's trying to maintain. And the irony? The deeper the connection, the stronger the urge to escape it. That's why he pulled away right when it was getting real, because you touched something inside him that couldn't be compartmentalized, something that couldn't be ignored. And so he retreated, fast, hard, completely. But here's the thing. Just because he left doesn't mean he let go. Just because he doesn't speak your name doesn't mean he doesn't hear it in his head. Just because he looks composed doesn't mean he doesn't break a little every time he feels something he can't explain. Avoidance hides it well, but it never heals what it refuses to face. This is where the illusion becomes the loudest and the most deceptive. He seems like he's doing great, like he just moved on without hesitation. New photos, new people, maybe even a whole new persona. He's acting like the past didn't touch him, like your connection was just a page he turned without a second thought. But that's exactly the point. It's an act, a coping mechanism, and it takes effort to maintain. Avoidant people are not indifferent, they're conflicted. The detachment you see is not peace, it's paralysis. It's someone who's still feeling everything but doesn't know how to let any of it show. Someone who's terrified that if they admit the depth of the bond, they'll have to confront why they couldn't hold it, why they let it go, why they left someone who actually saw them and still accepted them. So instead of facing that, they double down on the mask. They become louder in their silence, more committed to the idea that it didn't matter, that they're better off. But here's the thing. People who are at peace don't need to prove they're at peace. People who are really over something don't go out of their way to look over it. They don't flinch at memories. They don't rewrite history to avoid facing their own shortcomings. That kind of emotional rewriting, that's not confidence. That's fear. That's someone too emotionally overwhelmed to sit with the truth. So they run from it, and they hope that by running fast enough, they'll outrun the part of themselves that still misses you. The part that remembers the conversations that felt like coming home, the laughter that came too easily, the vulnerability they didn't expect and didn't know what to do with. But the body remembers, the heart remembers, even when the mouth stays shut, even when pride builds a fortress around feelings that were never meant to be buried. He remembers, not always consciously, not always clearly, but in those strange moments, the ones he can't explain. He feels it in the song that plays at the wrong time, in the way he avoids a place he used to love because it reminds him of you, in the way no one else seems to get him quite the same way. Avoidance is just that, avoiding, not forgetting, not letting go, not healing, just delaying, postponing the inevitable truth that you cannot outrun what is unresolved. And that's what makes this so hard to navigate for you, because from the outside, he looks calm, cool, maybe even happy, but you're the one left swimming in the aftermath, trying to decode mixed signals, trying to reconcile your heart's memory with his behavior. And the result is confusion, doubt, self-blame. But I want you to hear this clearly. Just because he refuses to acknowledge what happened doesn't mean it wasn't real. Just because he's silent doesn't mean you imagined the connection. Avoidance doesn't erase emotion, it buries it. And buried emotions don't just disappear, they settle under the surface and wait for their moment to rise. So if he's acting like he never cared, remind yourself, that kind of act takes energy. Indifference doesn't flinch. Indifference doesn't need an audience. But avoidance? Avoidance is full of resistance, performance, and unspoken truth. And the heavier the performance, the deeper the unresolved truth behind it. Let's talk about regret, not the kind you hear in movies, wrapped in apologies and second chances. The kind of regret I'm talking about is quiet, private, lingering. The kind that doesn't show itself in texts or calls or grand gestures, but in stillness, in silence, in the way he scrolls past your name in his phone without pressing it, in the way he sees something that reminds him of you, pauses, then quickly looks away. People with avoidant attachment don't show regret the way you might expect. They won't send a long message admitting they messed up. They won't call you crying at midnight saying they made a mistake, because regret for them isn't something they're ready to face out loud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because facing it means confronting the truth they've spent so much time avoiding, that you meant something real and they didn't know how to hold it. You see, someone who avoids emotion doesn't just run from people. They run from themselves, from the parts they've locked away, from the guilt of having received something deep and good and beautiful and pushing it away because they weren't ready, because they didn't have the tools, because it scared them. And when the dust settles, when the adrenaline of leaving fades, when the distractions grow quiet and the nights stretch long, that's when it starts to hit. That hollow feeling, that ache they can't explain. It's not just that they miss you, it's that they're beginning to see what they lost, what they ran from, what they weren't brave enough to face. But they won't call it regret, not even to themselves. They'll say the timing was off. They'll say it wasn't meant to be. They'll say you wanted too much. But deep down in the places they don't talk about, they know. They know you were the person who saw through the facade, who touched a part of them they thought no one ever could. And instead of leaning into that, they bailed. That realization doesn't arrive with a bang. It creeps in quietly over time. Regret for someone avoidant doesn't announce itself. It lives in avoidance, in the inability to form something real with someone else, in the way nothing quite compares, in the way emotional numbness takes over where connection used to live. And sometimes it doesn't hit them until long after you've let go, long after you've healed, long after they realize that what they were protecting themselves from was never a threat, it was a gift. But here's the hardest part. You may never see that regret. You may never hear it spoken. You may never get the closure you deserve, because pride is loud and fear of vulnerability is louder. And sometimes the mask of indifference stays on for so long that they forget how to take it off. So they carry that regret in silence, in subtle avoidance, in failed connections and restless nights. They carry it in the realization that they had something rare, and they let it go not because it wasn't right, but because they weren't ready. And that's a burden they'll have to bear, not out of punishment, but out of truth. Because when you walk away from something real out of fear, you don't escape the pain, you just delay it. And when it returns, it doesn't ask for permission. It shows up in dreams, in memories, in that one song they can't listen to anymore, in the way they try to recreate what they had with you, only to realize it's not there. That's the cost of avoidance. Not just losing you, but losing the version of themselves that only existed in your presence, the version that was open, seen, and vulnerable, if only for a moment. And now here you are, left to make peace with a silence you didn't choose, with a goodbye that wasn't spoken, just felt, with a connection that meant something but was never honored the way it deserved. You're the one left to untangle the meaning from the mess, the one carrying not just your own emotions, but the weight of what he couldn't say, wouldn't say, still can't say. But here's what you need to remember. Just because someone else didn't have the capacity to face their feelings doesn't mean those feelings weren't real. Just because they couldn't hold you doesn't mean you were too heavy. And just because they left doesn't mean they were right to go. Avoidant attachment doesn't just fracture relationships. It fractures the stories we tell ourselves in their absence. It makes us believe that maybe we were unlovable, too intense, too vulnerable, too much. But none of that is true. The truth is, you showed up. You were real. You let yourself be seen. And that takes courage. That takes strength. Because walking away is easy. Shutting down is automatic for someone who's never learned to stay emotionally present. But you stayed open. You felt it all. You processed the silence, the confusion, the grief. You sat in it, breathed through it, grew inside it. You didn't avoid, you evolved. And that's the difference. That's where your power lies, not in whether he ever admits what he felt, not in whether he ever comes back, but in the fact that you kept your heart intact. You didn't let his avoidance make you cold. You didn't let his silence define your story. You reclaimed it. You learned from it. You carried it with grace. You don't need an apology to move on. You don't need a confession to heal. You've already been doing the hardest part, facing what they couldn't, holding space for emotions they were too afraid to feel. And slowly, you've been walking yourself back home to self-respect, to clarity, to the kind of peace that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. So if he ever does feel the weight of what he lost, if he ever lies awake at night with your name circling his thoughts, know this: that's not your burden anymore. That's the cost of what he chose not to face when he had the chance. You were not the one who got away. You were the one he wasn't ready for. And that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of his readiness. You were a mirror. You showed him who he could be if he allowed himself to grow. And sometimes people aren't ready to meet that version of themselves. So they run, not from you, but from the self you awakened in them. But you're still standing, still growing, still capable of love that is honest, grounded, and whole. You've already won, not because he regrets losing you, but because you didn't lose yourself. And that, right there, is your closure.